why is Article 370 part of a section of the Constitution which is described as temporary, transitional and special provisions?
Because when we drafted 370, by that time Constituent Assembly of Kashmir has not met. It was temporary in the sense till the Kashmir's Constituent Assembly takes a view on it. Once Kashmir's Constituent Assembly has taken a view, then nothing can be done about it because they have finalized the relationship with Indian Union.
So the term temporary referred to that period till the Constituent Assembly in Kashmir had been convened. Till the assembly was convened, the government in Kashmir was with whom the government in Delhi had to concur in any changes they made to the status of Kashmir. After the Constituent Assembly was convened, you needed the Assembly's concurrence. That's why
Constituent Assembly.
Constituent Assembly. That's why this clause was called temporary.
Yes, temporary would mean temporary in period of time. I give you 3 examples. Reservation in Parliament for SCs and STs, it was for 10 years. English as official language for 15 years. But there, when a period is mentioned, then it is temporary.
Article 369, which is the preceding article, is only for 5 years.
5 years, yes.
What is Article 369, just for those
It is
who want
talking about trade within a state, and the Parliament was given a power to legislate on it for 5 years because the matter was treated as concurrent.
So you're making a very important point where in fact the Constitution intended things to be temporary. It specified the number of years for which it would apply. Yes. 5 in one instance, 10 in another, 15 in a third. But as far as Article 370 is concerned, they did not specify the time for which it would apply. And as you explained, it's only temporary because of the nature of its relationship with the Constituent Assembly. Till the